what you'll have is a piece of legislation on the table of President Trump, which says you have the power to sanction these people, which he already has the power to do. And so we end up right back where we started, which is that President Trump has to decide that he wants to cut off the lifeline to Putin. And he has regularly and consistently not cut off that lifeline.
So, Bill Browder, thank you so much for joining the Trump Report today.
Great to be here.
We have to start off with, of course, this news that Republican Senator Lindsey Graham, he's revealed on X that he's finally had Trump's blessing to go forward with his Russia sanctions bill that he unveiled way back in April. There's been plenty of stalling, mostly from what we assume to be Trump's side, but Lindsey has had 85 out of 100 co-sponsors from senators co-sponsoring this for months now. So just for the audience to understand what this is, the proposed bill would impose secondary sanctions and steep tariffs, reportedly up to around 500% on countries importing Russian energy and exports if Russia refuses to reach any peace agreements. The bill also imposes penalties on certain persons or individuals if they're doing the same. So, Bill, of course, this does still need to be voted on the Senate floor, but you and I have spoken about this for months and we've really been wanting to, get headway on this. So how significant is this?
Well, so let's be clear. The if this bill were to be passed and implemented, it would cause such an economic catastrophe for Vladimir Putin that he would have to end the war because he would run out of money. And let me just unpack this for you. So the reason that Russia has been able to, or I should say Putin has been able to execute this war for such a long period of time is because he has the money to do it. The money comes from the sale of oil, mainly to China, India, and Turkey. And up until now, we have been sort of nibbling around the edges, but we've not really gotten to the point of saying, we don't want anyone to buy that oil. If we got to that point, which this bill basically says, it would be so horrifically expensive for the companies and the countries that buy that oil that they would have to stop buying that oil. And if they stop buying that oil, then Putin would lose pretty much all of his all the money that he needs to fight this war, and then he'd be in an impossible situation, and then he would have to either he would lose on the battlefield because he'd run out of money, or he'd have to come to the negotiating table, which is what President Trump has been asking him to do since he became president. Now, very important caveat with this whole thing is that the power to sanction these countries or the individual companies is already within the power of the presidency. And so this bill doesn't force anybody to do anything. It just gives the power to President Trump to do something he already has the power to do. And so this is an amazing idea. It's an amazing signaling exercise. It will surely pass with 85 Senate co-sponsors. It will pass in the House of Representatives. And then what you'll have is a piece of legislation on the table of President Trump, which says you have the power to sanction these people, which he already has the power to do. And so we end up right back where we started, which is that President Trump has to decide that he wants to cut off the lifeline to Putin. And he has regularly and consistently not cut off that lifeline.
And I want to hone in on that, Bill, because it's an excellent point. And the topic of presidential veto and power has kind of been a big topic for the week, especially when it comes to these Epstein files and whether once it gets to his desk, whether he'd veto. It's the same with these things, whether he would implement these sanctions. So Trump and his team have told Lindsey Graham that the president will sign this once it goes to his desk, but he wants full decision making. So a White House official said that it's always been important to the White House and the president that there's a carve out in the sanctions package that ensures the president has the ultimate decision making authority on the sanctions. So as long as that is included, I think the president would entertain signing the bill. So, I mean, Bill, just to carry through with that point, does it make you question not only whether he would implement this, but whether he would really go to that 500% amount?
Well, he has the ability to do something like that today. He doesn't need a piece of legislation to do that. And in fact, if you remember with India, he's been playing around with all sorts of tariffs in relation to Russia, and them buying Russian oil. He hasn't done it with the Chinese. He hasn't done it with the Turks. He's got all sorts of other irons in the fire. Um, and so, I mean, it basically puts us back to square one, which is that President Trump has to be the one to decide to do this. And there's nothing unusual about this, by the way. When in almost all sanctions legislation, the Congress gives the president power to impose sanctions, but the president has to use that power. And so there's nothing different about this than other legislation. And so, but the question is, will Trump use that power? If you had asked me a month ago, I would have said I don't think so. However, if you ask me now, based on the sanctions that he imposed on Lukoil and Rosneft, the two largest oil companies in Russia, perhaps there's a chance that he would do this. And the reason I say that is that sanctioning Lukoil and Rosneft, while not having the same impact as sanctioning the buyers of the oil, is still a very significant thing. It's something that is pretty much unheard of in the previous the Biden administration, and unheard of during the first 9 months of Trump's presidency. And so, we're kind of in uncharted waters as far as how Trump is going to behave going forward in relation to Russia. I don't want to be optimistic here, because every time I've been optimistic, Trump has disappointed, but he has changed slightly his attitude based on these Lukoil and Rosneft sanctions that he imposed a couple weeks ago.
So these secondary sanctions, if, Trump signs them off and he actually puts, pen to power in conjunction with these ones that he's placed on Russia's two biggest oil companies, being Rosneft and Lukoil, as you mentioned, Bill, this is sure to make a dent and give Ukraine its own lifeline.
Well, so at the end of the day, war is about resources, and who has more resources to continue fighting the war. Historically, Russia had much more resources than Ukraine, because Russia is a huge commodity producer, and the resources come almost exclusively from the sale of crude oil to outside of Russia. Ukraine is a country that didn't have resources. And so there's two things going on. One is that there's a possibility, and I would say a pretty high possibility or probability at this point, that Ukraine is able to get the access to the $300 billion of frozen Russian central bank reserves. That seems to be moving forward in a way which I would predict in the next 3 to 6 months, Ukraine gets access to that money. So they get those resources. And if the United States and the EU and other countries cut off Russia from the resources that they need, which is the sale of crude oil, then there's a very real chance that the tables will turn. Because at the end of the day, it's all about, who can buy weapons, who can pay soldiers, and so on. And Putin has had that huge advantage up until and including now. But will he have that going forward? We don't know. Hopefully he doesn't.
Bill, one of the tactics that Donald Trump has used when he's in the midst of a scandal or headlines that he doesn't like is, of course, throwing another headline out to the media and see if they'll take the bait. So with obviously everything going on with the Jeffrey Epstein stuff right now, that is the dominating headline and has been for the last 3 or 4 days. So you said that you're a little bit more optimistic right now than you were, a couple of weeks ago, a couple of months ago when it comes to the sanctions package. Do you see Donald Trump using this to his advantage, almost signing it off and implementing more sanctions as a way to distract the media, distract Americans from what's happening with the Epstein files? I mean, I'm not saying that's a bad thing, because Ukraine should at least get something out of this.
Well, I mean, we're going into conspiracy theory and uncharted waters. I don't really want to go there. I don't know why Trump is motivated to do the things that he does. I do have significant concerns that his body language says that he has some type of affinity to Putin, whether it's he likes autocrats or whether he thinks that he's going to get some kind of benefit in the future. I don't know, but he hasn't behaved. I mean, the way that he behaves towards Mohammed bin Salman, who he met with yesterday, versus of Vladimir Zelensky is, sort of night and day. So it seems that Trump likes people who have a lot of money, and he doesn't like people who don't have a lot of money, and that's what it comes down to.
Finnish President Alexander Stubb, he's urged Trump to go forward with these sanctions, this sanctions package from Lindsey Graham. He spoke about the idea of a ceasefire as well. He said that failing all of this and reading the room right now, having had conversations with Vladimir Zelensky on Friday and with my American friends and European friends over the past few weeks, I just don't see that being a ceasefire in the card. So, I mean, Bill, you've spent the last 20 years understanding what economic reprimands mean and how much of a detrimental impact they can make on a country. So this really does feel like the way going forward from, the EU, from the United States, because a ceasefire kind of does feel off the cards, as he said.
Well, so at the moment, Putin continues to have his 100% maximalist objectives in this war. He has not altered his objectives since the day he started the war, and therefore, if he's not going to alter his objectives and he's going to carry on doing exactly what he planned to do, then we have to change the equation. And if we make it impossible for him financially to conduct this war, that's the only chance that there is going to be a ceasefire. And just so to put it on the table, Putin is the only person who can stop this war. The Ukrainians don't want to be. The Ukrainians are sitting there being bombed every day. They don't want to be bombed every day. They're ready to say, we don't want to be bombed every day. Putin is the one who's bombing them. And so the only way that this war is going to stop is if he stops bombing them. And the reason why he's bombing them is that he needs to distract his people from his own failings, which are extreme. And so he has no incentive to stop unless he no longer can do this bombing every day. And the way that happens is to create extreme economic pain. And that's what Lindsey Graham's bill would do if it was passed and if it was implemented by President Trump.
Well, let's get into kind of how, everyday Russians might be feeling in regards to this war, Bill. So Russia's economy is slowing down sharply. The output growth is projected to be around 1% this year. So to combat this, Putin needs to look for more money, more revenue. So reports are indicating the way in which he's going to do this is by increasing the value-added tax from 20% to 22%. He's lowering the threshold of which businesses must pay more tax, raising taxes on fees on alcohol, digital devices, car registrations, even, buying luxury goods. So can you walk me through this, strategy from the Kremlin and how much of an impact that has on everyday Russians?
Well, one of the most interesting parts of the whole thing is that the tax rate in Russia, the income tax rate is 13%. So if you're an oligarch and you're earning $1 billion off the sale of whatever product you're selling, you're only paying 13% tax versus, people paying whatever, 20, 30, 40% tax in other countries. What's interesting about the value-added tax is that that affects everybody. So Putin is basically saying, I need more money. I don't want to piss off the oligarchs, the people closest to me with all the money. And so we're going to put a broad tax on the average person of 22%. Now, there's one thing I want to correct you on, which is that you're quoting Russian economic statistics. Russia is a lying country. They lie on every different front. There's no reason to believe that those statistics are correct. I don't think that their economy is just, the growth is going down to 1%. It's probably well into the negatives and has been in the negatives for a very long time. The people who are enjoying life in Russia are those people who live in the center of Moscow and the center of St. Petersburg. Everybody else is suffering in in Russia. And I don't believe for a word they say when it comes to any economic statistics.
Well, how do you get the factual economic statistics, Bill?
You don't. If they don't publish them, you don't get them. I mean, you can look at objective, certain objective things, but even then, if the Russian State Statistics Committee is collecting the data and announcing the data, somebody's looking at that and saying, what do we want to show and what do we not want to show? And this is not unique to Russia. China does the same thing. You can't believe a dictatorship, a lying authoritarian regime when they come up with economic statistics. And so Russia is suffering. They have been suffering. The people who are not suffering are the elite, and the average person is suffering. But the average person suffering is not a voter. I mean, they might have a fake election, but not really voting. And if you say anything bad about Putin in Russia, you go to jail for 8 years. And so he can run a bad economy for a long time, and that's fine for him because he doesn't have to worry about his people because he's running such a climate of fear that nobody wants to say anything.
When you were living in Moscow, Bill, was the disparity between oligarchs and everyday Russians just as bad, just as big, or has it gotten worse, of course, with because we're in a war economy?
I think it's always been the most extreme of any country in the world. You know, there's literally 1,000 people who own all the assets of the country, and everybody else lives in destitute poverty. And so there may be a tiny, tiny middle class. I mean, we talk about polarization in other countries and economic dislocation, but nothing like in what we've seen in Russia. You know, in the U.S., in the UK, and various other places, there's a very, very solid middle class. Yes, there's some extremely rich people, and there are some poor people. But in Russia, pretty much everybody is poor, other than 1,000 people who are just the most spectacularly rich people on the planet.
Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov was asked about Russia and whether they'd missed an opportunity when they didn't go through this Budapest summit last month. Of course, obviously the US had a role to play in that, but Peskov said that we can hardly predict now when these conditions will arise, although, of course, we're all interested in these conditions occurring sooner rather than later. He said that more preparation needs to go through with it, but he also believes and wants this summit to take place in the near future. So, I mean, Russia, again, Bill, saying that willing to negotiate, willing to, be present in a summit. And this is happening within the same few days as Lindsey Graham discusses this bill publicly.
Well, I mean, I would not put any capital in anything that Dmitry Peskov says. This idea of a summit is nonsense. The summit is only about agreeing to something. Russia has made it absolutely clear they have no intention of agreeing to anything other than a full victory in Ukraine. And so what's the purpose of a summit? I mean, what Russia likes to hang these meetings and process out there as something to be doing, and the only purpose of that is to avoid consequences from the United States. And they've been very good at that so far. Trump has made all sorts of requests and demands of Putin to stop this war, having meetings and summits and so on and so forth. And of course, there was that famous red carpet Anchorage, Alaska debacle. But in the end, all these things are meant to do is to buy more time so that Russia, in their own mind, can somehow finish off Ukraine or get everybody else to lose patience or lose interest in funding Ukraine. There is no intention, and they've been so clear about it. I mean, that's Russia lies about everything other than one thing, and that is their intentions on Ukraine. They've not been lying about that. Their intentions are a full capitulation of Ukraine. They want Ukraine to be subsumed by Russia. They want to basically rape all the women, incarcerate all the men, and kidnap all the children. That's their approach towards occupation, and that's what they want to do with Ukraine. And the Ukrainians, no matter how terrible this war is, that's more terrible.
Ukraine has been pressing its European allies in the EU to make a decision next month to basically release these frozen state Russian assets. It's around 163 billion US dollars. The EU failed to kind of make a decision on this last month, but they've got another summit and meeting scheduled for December 18th. So Zelensky is basically saying that this is a key moment because Ukraine could face a budget shortfall in early 2026, especially if, Trump only gives a limited amount of aid. So how important is it for EU leaders to prioritize this on December 18th?
I think this is, other than cutting off the oil, this is the other crucial question, which is Ukraine needs the resources to fight the war. The U.S. has cut off military aid to Ukraine. This is the one way in which Ukraine can carry on for the next 3 or 4 years. I think Europe understands very clearly that if Ukraine is starved of resources, they'll lose the war. If they lose the war, then Putin will be making a move on Poland or Estonia or Lithuania, and therefore they're going to do what needs to be done. It's been an awkward process, but everything done at the EU is awkward because of so many different voices. I predict that it will get done on December 18th, and if it doesn't get done on that date, soon thereafter.
So, Bill Browder, thank you for joining the Trump Report today.
Thank you.